Bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Gravediggers.
Marhaba. Hi, everyone.
Salam alaikum, everyone. Amr in Toronto, as usual.
And Aaron in Seoul. Sorry if you hear any traffic noises.
Yeah, Seoul in the morning and Toronto at night. It is 8:30 p.m. and very quiet here.
I've got a loud fridge as well. It's really old and it's not mine. I'm a renter, so sorry. So we're on to Libya this week. Libya was very difficult to research. I knew a bit about Libya prior to the episode. I had read Gaddafi's Green Book. I had done some additional reading on the uprising in Libya, but the timeline of this case in particular is very confusing. For instance, I had assumed that Gaddafi was still alive when the American diplomats were killed in Benghazi, and that this was one catalyst for the American intervention there, but I was completely wrong. That came a year after the NATO bombings in Libya and Gaddafi's death. So if you, like me, don't know really what's going on, but you thought you did, you've come to the right place.
Yeah, I found it difficult to research for this episode in terms of finding a coherent narrative. I get it on one end because technically Libya's thing is still ongoing. Unlike Tunisia, which did its revolution, and Egypt, which faced a counter coup, as you saw with our previous episodes. With Libya, it's still a fractured country with no real national government, which we will get into in the series. But yeah, there was a lot of things I didn't quite understand until I did research for this episode. And even then, it was very, very difficult to find sources that weren't like the New York Times basically saying, yeah, this is why we should bomb Libya.
Just a note, again, I am working far too many hours right now at a pretty thankless job. Please, I am trying my best. We are recording this and I'm going to start editing it right away. But sometimes there's just nothing that we can do in terms of recording, editing, trying to put the episode out at a consistent time. We are always dedicated to doing this show, but I literally came home last night and just sobbed overwhelmed tears. So thank you guys for your patience. We do want to give a content warning for this episode. There are descriptions of violence, including sexual violence. We will let you know when those are about to happen, but just so you know, it is a civil war in Libya. There are descriptions of violence. On the 14th of January, 2011, Tunisia, Libya's neighbor to the northwest, toppled longtime dictator Zine Abidine Ben Ali and vowed to establish a democracy in the small country. Less than a month later, on the 11th of February, 2011, Egypt, Libya's neighbor to the east, overthrew its authoritarian president Hosni Mubarak. A few days later, protests began in Benghazi, Libya, attempting to oust Libya's longtime ruler, Muammar Gaddafi. But despite being sandwiched between Tunisia and Egypt, Libya's revolt and its consequences bear significant distinctions from the previous uprisings we've covered, most notably NATO's intervention and the country's descent into two civil wars as a direct result of these events. To this day, Libya remains in crisis. This past week, for instance, 43 men from West Africa drowned off the Libyan coast while trying to depart for Europe. The case of Libya forces us to examine the just war theory often purported by Western governments to justify foreign intervention. How did Libya go from one of the most prosperous African nations to a land of chaos in such a short time? How is it similar to, and notably different from the uprisings we've already discussed, Tunisia, Egypt, and Bahrain? And how can we take a nuanced approach to international solidarity and critical support without enabling imperialist intervention? In order to really understand what happened in Libya, we have to go back to about 100 years before the Civil War. In 1911, Italy attacked and conquered Libya, which was then ruled by the Ottomans, but only loosely, and established colonial rule over the area, exploiting and brutalizing the country until the Allied forces took it in 1943.
Yeah, Italy came to the scramble for Africa quite late, but it still saw itself as part of a coterie of great powers that were by right entitled to colonies on the continent. Thus its conquest of Libya and eventual conquest of Ethiopia, the latter having had several failed attempts initially.
Libya was then actually called the provinces of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, and refused to submit to Italian colonialism, particularly Mussolini's fascist rule. Figures like Omar Mukhtar, a Senussi sheikh, led resistance movements in the country. Italy committed horrific war crimes during this colonial regime, including forced migrations and the use of concentration camps. From the Wikipedia page on Italian colonization in Libya, quote, "Typhus and other diseases spread rapidly in the camps as the people were physically weakened by meager food rations provided to them and forced labor. By the time the camps closed in September 1933, 40,000 of the 100,000 total internees had died in the camps." End quote. Other Italian crimes in Libya include the use of illegal chemical weapons, executing surrendering combatants, mass executions of civilians, ethnic cleansing by forcibly expelling 100,000 Bedouin Cyrenaicans, almost half of the population of Cyrenaica, to give land to the Italians, the deliberate bombing of civilians, killing unarmed children, women, and the elderly, rape and disembowelment of women, throwing prisoners out of aircraft to their death and running over others with tanks, regular daily executions of civilians in some areas, and bombing tribal villages with mustard gas bombs. We're telling you this to note the not-so-distant history of ruthless colonialism in Libya. Just as the horrors of fascism heavily impacted European politics and society in the early 20th century, Libya has likewise been affected by such gruesome rule. After World War II, the UN General Assembly calls for Libya to be granted its independence. By this point, Libya is no longer under Italian control, as it had been captured by the Allied forces, who went on to win the war. In 1951, the political and religious leader Idris I is declared king of the United Kingdom of Libya. King Idris is extraordinarily friendly to the West, allowing the US and UK to establish military bases in Libya in return for economic aid.
Yeah, interestingly enough, King Idris also married Fatima al-Sharif, the daughter of the supreme head of the Senussi religious order, Ahmed Sharif al-Senussi. So this gave Idris religious authority in addition to political authority. And I want to put a plug on this for now because the Senussiya, which are a sort of Sufi tariqa, Sufi religious order, are very prominent in Libya, especially in the eastern part around the city of Benghazi. We're going to come back to this later in the series because the sort of accusations and counter-accusations by people loyal to Gaddafi that the rebels are Islamists aren't entirely unfounded in that sense.
In 1959, oil is discovered in Libya, and the oil industry develops there rapidly. Meanwhile, King Idris consolidates power as a unitary politician, banning political parties in 1963. Still, Idris couldn't stop the rise of Arab nationalism and socialism in Libya. Muammar Gaddafi ascends to power in 1969 after a revolutionary coup d'etat overthrowing the monarchical regime of King Idris. At the time, Idris was in Turkey receiving medical treatment, making this a bloodless coup. Also, this is just a side note, young Gaddafi was very hot. I would like to find out his skincare routine and then do the exact opposite because he aged, unfortunately, poorly.
I'm pretty sure his skincare routine consisted of being broiled under the Libyan sun. So I guess as long as you stay out of, North African climates, you should be okay.
Yeah, that's not really good news for me going off to Lebanon and Jordan every summer.
That is a good point. Though, also, I believe that Gaddafi spent a lot of time outdoors, and I'm pretty sure he didn't use sunscreen. But I do agree, he was quite attractive in his youth. One thing I also respect about him is that he retained the rank of colonel, which was his rank at the time of the coup. And, most heads of state in his position would have, promoted themselves to something like Supreme General Imperator and put on 100 medals on themselves. But credit to the man for, sticking with his rank that he left the military with.
Gaddafi did actually sort of declare himself as king of kings in Africa. He was a pan-Arabist for a while. And then when he was largely rejected, he kind of switched his gaze to Africa.
It's basically the "you can't fire me, I quit" of political bouncing. He pretty much bounced through every single ideology in 20... you have to respect that. I genuinely respect the fact that he went from different extremes in 30 years. That is admirable. That is incredible.
Speaking of which, at first, Gaddafi seems to follow the precedents set by Nasser in Egypt, nationalizing the important industries like oil, promoting pan-Arabism, and casting himself as a somewhat paternal figure in this revolution. Gaddafi calls this the Jamhuriya, or state of the masses. And this term was coined by Gaddafi in sort of a political way and later added to the official name of the country.
Yeah, so Jamahiriya comes from the Arabic word jamhur, which literally just means the crowd or the masses. So today, Jumhuriya or Jamahiriya just generally translates to the abstract concept of a republic. And I believe you have it in several countries' names.
Yeah, you have like the Jumhuriya al-Lubnaniya, like the Lebanese Republic.
Or Jumhuriyat before, during Saddam's time, Jumhuriyat al-Iraq. So, yeah.
Yeah, but a Jumhuriyat al-Lubnaniya rhymes, so...
Oh, yeah, I mean, whoever came up with that, that's a good shout.
Gaddafi also publishes Al-Kitab al-Akhdar, which literally means the Green Book, a manifesto of his political philosophies. I've read it, and I personally didn't find myself nodding along like I did when I first read the Manifesto or Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin. I mean, it's got your run-of-the-mill state socialism plus some rambling about the role of women, but it's easy to find online if you're interested. We'll link it in our sources. You can check it out yourself.
Yeah, I always find it hilarious how leftists, like, online on Twitter would, like, post the Green Book as a book to recommend to people. Because I read it, and it's the most inane, banal ramblings one of the most I've ever read. You're right, it has, like, the usual, like, nationalize this and that. But the part about women is hilarious, because I remember at one bit he goes, like, men and women are different, because men are men and women are women. And I'm like, hell yeah, dude, this is some big brain time.
Yeah, he also starts to say capitalism is keeping women from their rightful role. And I'm like, yeah, rightful role as community leaders. And he's like, no, in the kitchen.
Yeah. Oh man, that ruled. I'm like, yeah, basically he's like, capitalism has made women become like part of the workforce, which is bad because they shouldn't be in the workforce. And I'm like, well, I mean, fair enough, dude. Also, I like the fact that he called his thing the Green Book because he's trying to copy Mao's Little Red Book with like far less charisma and far less stuff to talk about.
Yeah, but he's using the color green because it's a color heavily associated with Islam. But he really wavers back and forth between how much he wants to use Islam in a Jumhuriyah.
Yeah, oh yeah, he bounces between socialism and Islam for a while before settling on Pan-Arabism, and then going back to Islam, and then going back to Pan-Africanism. And yeah, it's just a lot of jumping around. And speaking of the color green, as far as I know, the Green Book has been adapted to an Academy Award-winning movie titled Green Book, starring Viggo Mortensen as Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. At least this is what I like to think. I don't want to be corrected. I may be wrong, but I refuse to accept any other explanation. Please don't DM us to correct this assumption. For all I care about, the movie Green Book is about Muammar Gaddafi.
Yeah, when Green Book was trending on Twitter like a couple years ago during the Academy Awards, I was like, what the fuck? Why is everyone talking about Gaddafi?
Yes, I'm sure liberal Hollywood elites all suddenly found Muammar Gaddafi's Green Book and are reading it in their book clubs.
So, Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, also became a prominent figure in Libyan politics, becoming somewhat synonymous with his father, and, some assume that he's being groomed to eventually take over.
Yeah, I mean, for Saif al-Islam, just to let you know, Saif al-Islam translates to Sword of Islam in English, which, I think highlights Gaddafi's flirtation with Islamism and, Islamic politics back and forth. Also, another one of his sons, Saadi, was a professional football player who played at clubs in Italy's Serie A in the mid-2000s. And from what I understand, he was not particularly good and was given contracts at clubs as part of a broader Italian national strategy by Berlusconi to attempt to curry favor with Gaddafi.
That's so funny, actually.
Yeah, he was pretty wank. Like he wasn't good at football by any means.
So Gaddafi is among the most contentious figures among the left, with some hailing him as an anti-imperialist hero of the masses and others condemning him as an ostentatious dictator. And while I'm frankly turned off by any cult of personality around a political figure, whether it be Gaddafi or AOC, for instance, I think it is crucial to note that Gaddafi did support several anti-imperialist struggles, but also led some destructive and politically foolish campaigns. On different branches of the left, you have people like Gilbert Ashkar and Patrick Coburn, both of whom I respect, taking wildly distinct stances on Gaddafi. Ashkar accuses him of liberalizing the Libyan economy and leaving the masses behind, whereas Coburn claims the West turned against Gaddafi and deposed him due to his radicalism. To be honest, I find the so-and-so did nothing wrong camps grating and immature, but I also think it's far more necessary to point our criticisms at capitalist and imperialist nations before nitpicking African leaders. This all makes it extremely difficult to discern why people were protesting against Gaddafi in 2011, as different journalists and academics seem to interpret their demands with varied lenses. Ashkar, for instance, claims that the federal development he catalogues in most Arab uprising states is also emblematic of Gaddafi's Libya, and therefore it was Gaddafi's slouch toward neoliberalism that finally pushed the protests into a full-scale rebellion. Coburn, alternatively, describes the rebels as primarily conservative Islamists opposed to Gaddafi's secularism and social reforms, but even admits that Gaddafi's family is quote-unquote ghastly.
Yeah, so one of Gaddafi's great anti-imperialist sort of big brain ideas that I often see praised on left Twitter is his ridiculously harebrained proposal for a pan-African currency pegged to oil prices. Now, a pan-African currency in and of itself is a pretty good idea. I'm not belittling that part. But pegging any currency to a commodity as volatile and unstable as oil is pretty much begging for an economic disaster. Because, I don't know how many of our listeners are economics heads or whatever, but just a quick primer. Currency is basically an IOU note that until Nixon depegged the US dollar and made it a floating currency away from the gold standard, up until that point, it meant that a central bank of the government that issued whatever currency you have possesses an amount of gold equivalent to the currency's purported value. And that, you can go to the central bank and ask for the gold back, in theory. Not in practice, but in theory. So the reason gold is a great currency reserve is because it's an inert metal, it doesn't react easily under room conditions, it doesn't rust, it doesn't dissipate, it can be melted and forged into smaller and larger units as needs dictate, and its prices are fairly stable. Oil is the exact opposite of that in every sense. First of all, because its value comes strictly from using it, burning it for energy. Its prices are very volatile. You can't just keep oil in a reserve just for its own value because its value strictly comes from being used. Now, currency is no longer pegged to the gold reserve because the US dollar is floating and all other currencies have the reserve as the US dollar or the euro. But in any sense, the fact that he thought that pegging a currency to something as volatile as oil is just one of the most absurd things I've ever heard. And anyone who thinks that's a good idea needs to get their head checked, in my opinion. The other thing I want to say is that Gaddafi helped with some anti-imperial struggles, including, I believe, and I could be wrong here, supplying arms to the Provisional IRA.
No, that's right.
Yeah, okay, so that's good. I support that. But at the same time, I find the inability of the left to distinguish constructive criticism from outright promotion of intervention to be rather concerning. First of all, Gaddafi's anti-imperialist bona fides they should come under greater scrutiny because, as far as I can tell, post 9/11 and post 2001, Gaddafi tried to ingrain himself with the West, first of all by disabling his WMD programs after seeing what happened with Saddam, and secondly by, I don't want to say promoting because that's the wrong word, but sort of positioning Libya as a potential black site for CIA operations, including enhanced interrogations of suspects, which they did in Libya back when Gaddafi was, considered a friend, or at least, an asset, as they say in the CIA speak. So the idea that, he's unblemished hero is in and of itself a very, very flawed concept. Also, the other part is just because someone is disliked by the US imperial apparatus, it doesn't inherently make them good or admirable. The US also fought against the Japanese Empire, but surprise, Emperor Hirohito isn't, by definition of the word emperor, an anti-imperialist hero, for God's sake.
Yeah, I think the discussion on Libya overall is just lacking. And I think part of that is because Libya, in a way, is in the periphery. It doesn't have, and we'll go on to discuss this, but it doesn't have the benefit of being first like Tunisia or the benefit of being populous like Egypt. So in a way, it's just kind of pushed to the side. And there are two civil wars as a result of this uprising. Frankly, I don't think a lot of people even know that there have been two distinct civil wars.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure most people don't know what's happening in Libya right now, which is like the middle of another civil war. But I also think that the fact that it's on the periphery, like it's in the periphery in the sense that it didn't hold any significant consciousness in the Western consciousness, any significant position in terms of the revolution, but also the way the US media works, the way the Western press works in general, is such that when a country falls into absolute chaos and pandemonium after a failed Western intervention, and I use failed here in quotation marks because they succeeded in their initial goal of removing Gaddafi. So whether they failed or not is arguable. But in the sense of destabilizing a country through Western intervention, the Western press's MO is often to just stop talking about the country. How many pieces do you see about Iraq or Afghanistan now?
Right. And when the West does talk about Libya, it's solely in relation to, for instance, African migrants trying to come to Europe, who mostly depart from Libya, sometimes Tunisia. And it is true that under the Gaddafi government, there were fewer dinghies leaving from the Libyan coast to come to Europe. And that's for a few reasons. First, it's because Gaddafi had a rule that anyone from Africa could come work in Libya. So people who were struggling in other parts of the continent would come up to Libya, maybe planning to leave, maybe planning to stay, but they would end up staying because they'd get a job. And then that's that. That's what they were looking for. So, they have a better life in Libya, and there's no reason to leave. There's no reason to risk your life trying to flee, trying to go to a better place when you're already in one. But also, Gaddafi had a really firm hold on that country, and his forces were pretty good at preventing people from going on an extremely perilous journey across the Mediterranean. And since he has been deposed, of course, as we know, there are dozens of African men mostly dying in the Mediterranean every single week. It's a disaster. It's just a complete disaster.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also important to note, and I think we're going to come back to this in the next episode when we talk about the aftermath of the civil war and the revolution. But after Gaddafi was, deposed, those people that came to Libya, the people from Africa that came to Libya for good jobs and decent pay, and by all accounts, from what I've read, Libya's economy before the civil war was quite, healthy and quite robust. Granted, it was highly reliant on oil exports, which, seeing as how countries like Venezuela and Libya, which rely heavily on oil to fund state programs, it's always a matter of when, not if, parts of the economy crumble, because you shouldn't be relying on extracting a natural resource as a sole source of income. But definitely the racism, anti-Black racism was at play here. And, you definitely hear about, it's very common to hear about African men being kidnapped by Libyan militias and their families in their home countries being rung up and asked to pay up money to release their family member, or otherwise they get sold into slavery or killed.
So now we get into the actual events of the uprising. On February 15th, 2011, protests against Gaddafi begin in Benghazi under the banner of the Arab uprisings happening in neighboring countries, Tunisia and Egypt, plus Yemen and Bahrain at this point. Protests are particularly fueled by the arrest of Libyan human rights lawyer Fatih Tarbel, who represented the families of the victims of the alleged Abu Salim prison massacre of 1996, an event which the Gaddafi government denied. Though Human Rights Watch claims that as many as 1,200 prisoners were gunned down at the prison, accounts by journalists, including an investigation by CNN and the National Transitional Council in Libya after Gaddafi was deposed, cast doubt on this figure. So basically, Fatih Tarbel and these families are saying people were massacred in this prison in 1996, and the Libyan government is saying, no, they weren't.
The Libyan government saying, what prison?
Again, it's extremely difficult to get a clear answer about anything to do with Libya. Like the Lockerbie bombing? Maybe. Abu Salim prison massacre? Maybe. Shooting unarmed protesters in Benghazi? Maybe. Libya is a conspiracy theorist heaven. And remember what we said about conspiracy theories, they only have to be right 1% of the time to cast doubt on the other 99% of media we see about some circumstance.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And just bear with me here, but I just imagined a very hilarious comic skit where the lawyer and the families of the victims are claiming that 1,270 prisoners were gunned down at prison. And Gaddafi, having recently read Michel Foucault, responds with, isn't all of life a prison in some sense?
Oh, no.
I need to work on, getting that skit done. Maybe with Mitchell and Webb. Mitchell and Webb would definitely do that. Anyways, this is true. So this idea of Libya being a sort of black hole of conspiracy theories, rather a mountain of conspiracy theories, It's even true after Gaddafi was deposed, because things like Benghazi I actually found very difficult to research for this episode. And generally finding information about these things is very, very difficult.
As to why people are protesting, there are varied reports. People are angry about the civic repression under the Gaddafi government, as demonstrated in the arrest of Fatih Tarbel. And frankly, they were probably energized and inspired by the movements in Tunisia and Egypt. Haven't you ever gone to a protest just to, go? But this doesn't explain the complete and near immediate mobilization of an armed rebel insurgency. Libyans call for a day of rage on February 17th, 2 days later. Mass protests break out in Benghazi, Tripoli, the capital, and neighboring cities. Libyan security forces fire on the crowd, causing the protests to escalate.
Yeah, so what strikes me in doing this series about the Arab Spring is the speed at which national security forces resort to live fire on protesters. Conversely, this only highlights the distinction between fear of repression and not having anything to lose anymore. Because once a sitting government opens fire on protesters, that essentially only solidifies the protesters' assumption that they have nothing to lose. Because if you're afraid of, violence by the government on your person and the people you care about, and they start applying that violence, well, there's nothing left they could do anymore. They're doing the worst thing they can do. So at that point, you just have nothing to lose, and the situation just becomes untenable, and any political compromise becomes pretty much impossible. And the outcome is either a government victory through, massacres and blood, a coup, or a civil war or a fractal war.
It actually took fewer than 24 hours since the start of the Day of Rage for protesters in Benghazi to overwhelm police and security forces. It's possible that some of the Libyan army's ineptitude at quelling the protests was due to deliberate weakening by Gaddafi, who feared the possibility of a coup, and given that he rose to power through a military officer coup, rightfully so.
Yeah, you see this in many autocratic countries. It's a very common trope where leaders, incumbents, are fearful of their own military apparatus. Here's another example. After the 1979 Grand Mosque hostage crisis in Mecca, which, by the way, we should do a separate episodes on because that's one of the most fascinating things. It was done by members of the army and the National Guard of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi royal family essentially saw both as unreliable branches, had them both purged and thus weakened in favor of essentially the Air Force. It still remains a sort of elite cavalry unit, largely comprised by the Saud royals themselves, princes and such, and allied clans, closely allied families and clans. And in fact, as of now, the Saudi army is practically non-existent. If you look at the war in Yemen, the Saudis' groundwork is essentially done by the likes of Sudanese and Colombian mercenaries because they just don't have an army of their own.
Gaddafi's government quickly claims that the protesters are Islamic fundamentalists and agents of the United States, Europe, and Israel. As we've mentioned, unlike in Tunisia, Egypt, and Bahrain, the motivations of the protests in Libya seem to be more contentious. To be honest, this episode has been the hardest to research thus far. Tunisia has a lot of think pieces as the seat of the Arab uprisings and the only quote-unquote successful revolt. Egypt has a huge population and marks a cultural center of the region, meaning that it's heavily represented in the news. And Amr is from Bahrain and thus uniquely positioned to share his knowledge on the events there. Thank you for that. Though Bahrain is otherwise among the forgotten revolts. Those opposing Gaddafi form an interim governing body, quote-unquote, called the National Transitional Council, or NTC, which had support from NATO, some Gulf and wannabe Gulf countries like the UAE, Qatar, and Jordan, and allegedly Al-Qaeda. I want to read a quote by academics Asli Ubali and Ziad Abu Rish from an article called Solidarity and Intervention in Libya, dated March 16, 2011. It's a long quote, but I want to share it for 3 reasons. First, it does a good job of summarizing the events of the first month of the Libyan uprising. Second, it demonstrates that even as these events were occurring, those looking critically at Libya were taking a nuanced view of the situation. And third, it completely eviscerates the idea that the United States and NATO could not have been aware that intervention in Libya would lead to pandemonium. Quote, "The Libyan uprising is entering its 4th week. The courage and persistence of the Libyan people's efforts to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi have been met with ongoing regime brutality ranging from shoot-to-kill policies to the indiscriminate use of artillery against unarmed civilians. The mounting civilian death toll resulting from regime brutality has amplified previous calls for international intervention. The UN Security Council unanimously issued a resolution imposing tough measures against the Libyan regime, including an arms embargo, asset freeze, travel ban, and a referral of the situation in Libya to the International Criminal Court for investigation. More recently, the Arab League has called on the Security Council to impose a no-fly zone over Libya. The issue of a no-fly zone is only one of several proposals now being loudly advocated. Others include funneling arms to Libyan rebels and proposals to coordinate with Egyptian commandos allegedly already operating in Libya to provide logistical assistance and training to the rebels. Despite the intuitive appeal of the argument that something must be done, we write again now to oppose calls for the types of international intervention that are currently under discussion." End quote. Clearly, these authors are not fans of the Gaddafi government, but they are calling for non-intervention in Libya. I really want to emphasize that. As we now know, the UN Security Council did enforce a no-fly zone over Libya, which turned into a NATO bombing campaign against the country, including 796 attacks on named targets by, and this is in order of descending involvement, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Italy, Canada, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Belgium, Spain, Turkey, the Netherlands, Jordan, the UAE, Qatar, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece. So basically what's happening here, NATO, led by the United States and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in particular, convinced the UN Security Council to issue a no-fly zone over Libya, claiming that Gaddafi was about to bomb the living daylights out of his opponents, and then proceeded to bomb the living daylights out of Libya anyway, causing the country to descend into absolute chaos.
This is some real Dr. Strangelove scenario. Basically, I can imagine Hillary Clinton yelling at Gaddafi, being like, "You can't bomb Libya, that's our job. We're the ones who should bomb Libya, not you." Very, very thick of it, grim, dark misery. But in any case, once the no-fly order was issued, the writing was on the wall for Gaddafi. I mean, what keeps autocrats in power is a superior air force. Like I mentioned before, it's the elite cavalry unit of the military. And once that was taken out of the equation with the no-fly order, it became a fractal war between armies in which the rebels were fighting on much, much more even ground, given their arms were supplied by NATO and the Gulf.
By this point, as Amr just noted, Libya was in a full-scale civil war between the Gaddafi government and the rebels. From then on, Gaddafi and his forces were basically on the run from the rebels/National Transitional Council. With the assistance of the NATO bombing campaign and the Gaddafi government's inability to retaliate due to sanctions and the no-fly zone, it was only a matter of time until the National Transitional Council took the seat of the government in Tripoli. This happened in August of 2011, when the rebel forces captured Tripoli with the help of a huge NATO bombing campaign. Gaddafi himself managed to evade capture, but he was living on borrowed time. On September 16, 2011, the United Nations recognizes the National Transitional Council as the legal representative of Libya, thereby replacing the Gaddafi government. Libya is now just called the State of Libya, no more Jamhuriya. This doesn't mean that every country has accepted or established ties with the NTC, but that enough voted in favor at the UN to make it official. At the time of recording, 106 countries have formally recognized the NTC as the government of the State of Libya. But skirmishes between the new rebel government and Gaddafi's government or loyalists still continue. On October 20th, 2011, Muammar Gaddafi is captured and killed by NTC forces during the Battle of Sirte. The NTC originally claims that Gaddafi died in a firefight when his own troops attempted to free him from capture, but a graphic video later resurfaced. Now, here's a warning, this is very gruesome. If you don't like gruesome descriptions, please skip forward about 30 seconds. The video showed rebel fighters beating Gaddafi and sodomizing him with a bayonet as he pleaded for his life. He died when they shot him several times. Now, you probably already know Gaddafi's death then became somewhat of a meme in the West, which is incredibly sick. Poor Edward Said is having an aneurysm, even though he's been dead for 17 years.
Yeah, I mean, that aside, unlike Tunis and Yemen, or Tunisia and Yemen, where nearby allies in the shape of Saudi offered sanctuary to the beleaguered incumbents, Gaddafi had no friends in the neighborhood by that point. He'd managed to alienate everyone. I do recall he was offered asylum by Mugabe of Zimbabwe, but by this point, with the airports taken by the rebels and the rebels themselves in no mood to allow Gaddafi a dignified exit, that was pretty much a pipe dream.
It's worth noting as well, it was actually Gaddafi's Libya who provided cover to Ben Ali as he was fleeing Tunisia, air cover, but now Ben Ali is gone, Mubarak is gone, no one is left for him.
Yeah, as the common saying goes, with friends like these who needs enemies.
Next week, we will check back in on the NTC and Libya and oh God, oh no, it's Islamist. It's immediately rolling back protections for women.
Surprise!
So we're going to do an episode on Benghazi next week and try to separate fact from fiction and examine why we should blame Hillary Clinton, but not for the reasons most people think.
Yeah, noted feminist and woman liberator Hillary Clinton, who checks notes, basically funded and armed an Islamist insurrection against a secular government.
Benghazi obviously has become such a key word, such a flashpoint in American politics, but I don't think most people really know why. Like, you just hear Benghazi and then you think, oh, Hillary Clinton, bad, but like, why?
It's funny because to me, like from what I observe, Benghazi is to like Republicans and conservatives what Ukraine is to Democrats and libs, in the sense that nobody quite understands what you mean when you say it, but it's just a buzzword that you can accuse the opponent of. Like, I guess means corruption in some general sense.
Yeah, we're gonna try our best to get into everything that happened there. Libya is just so difficult to research.
Oh yeah.
So if you like our content, you can find us on Patreon at Das Criminal and on Instagram at Das Criminal Pod, and subscribe, tell your friends, please rate and review. It really does help drive us up in the search algorithms, and the more people find the podcast and, find an episode and hopefully enjoy it, they might come back week after week.
Yeah, thanks everyone. We really appreciate your support, and until next time, hope you have a good week.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.